In 1940, the world expected quiet. After months of the so-called phony war, where British and French troops sat behind the Maginot Line while Hitler consolidated his conquest of Poland, both sides seemed content to wait. Neville Chamberlain, Britain's Prime Minister, told the House of Commons on April 4, 1940, that Hitler had missed the bus by not attacking earlier. The newspapers printed it. People believed it. 3 days later, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. But that was just the opening act. On May 10, 1940, the real catastrophe began. At dawn, German forces launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, a massive offensive that sent 141 divisions crashing into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The world had never seen anything like it. This wasn't the trench warfare of 1914, this was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Stuka dive bombers screamed out of the sky while panzer columns punched through defensive lines that military experts had sworn were impregnable. The Dutch army, considered well-trained and prepared, lasted 5 days. The Belgians held out for 18. Here's what made it so terrifying: the speed. In World War I, armies measured progress in yards per week. In May 1940, German mechanized units were covering 50 miles per day. French and British commanders were still thinking in terms of the last war, expecting weeks to reposition forces and establish new defensive lines. But by the time orders reached frontline units, the situation had already changed. Radio intercepts were obsolete before they could be decoded. Reconnaissance reports described German positions that had moved 20 miles by the time the report reached headquarters. The French had the Maginot Line, a supposedly invincible chain of fortifications along the German border. It had cost the equivalent of $3 billion in today's money. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, with underground railways, air-conditioned barracks, and retractable gun turrets. There was just one problem: it didn't extend along the Belgian border. The French High Command assumed the Ardennes forest was impassable to tanks. They were catastrophically wrong. On May 13th, German panzer divisions emerged from the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, the same place where France had been defeated in 1870. History has a dark sense of humor. Within a week, German forces had driven a wedge between the British Expeditionary Force and the main French armies. The BEF, nearly 400,000 British and French troops, was being pushed toward the coast, with their backs to the English Channel. In London, the War Office was receiving reports that read like horror stories. Entire divisions were out of contact. Supply lines had collapsed. Refugees clogged every road, making military movement nearly impossible. And across the Channel in Berlin, the champagne was already being poured. German intelligence estimated that Britain would sue for peace within 3 weeks of France's collapse, maybe 4. After all, what choice did they have? The British Army was about to be destroyed in France. The Royal Navy couldn't stop tanks, and Britain had neither the industrial capacity nor the manpower to stand against the Wehrmacht alone. Surrender wasn't just expected. It was considered inevitable by virtually every military analyst in Europe. Even some in London were quietly agreeing. Neville Chamberlain's government was collapsing even faster than France. On May 7th and 8th, Parliament held what became known as the Norway Debate, a brutal post-mortem of Britain's failed campaign to prevent Germany's takeover of Norway. Conservative MP Leo Amery stood up and quoted Oliver Cromwell, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." The chamber erupted. When the vote came, Chamberlain's majority collapsed from over 200 to just 81. He'd won the vote, but lost the confidence of Parliament. More importantly, he'd lost the confidence of the nation. But here's where it gets interesting. Chamberlain didn't want to resign. He tried to form a coalition government with Labour and the Liberals. They refused to serve under him. The 2 candidates to replace him were Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. Halifax was the establishment choice, aristocratic, diplomatic, respected in the Foreign Office. Churchill was the maverick, brilliant but erratic, a former liberal who'd switched parties, blamed for the Gallipoli disaster in World War I, and had spent the 1930s in political wilderness, warning about Hitler while everyone called him a warmonger. On May 9th, Chamberlain met with Halifax and Churchill to discuss who should succeed him. According to Churchill's own account, There was a long silence after Chamberlain asked Halifax if he would take the job. Halifax later wrote that he felt being in the House of Lords would make it impossible to lead a war government effectively. But historians have debated whether Halifax simply didn't want the responsibility of leading Britain through what looked like certain defeat. Sometimes the most important decisions in history are the ones not to act. So it fell to Churchill. At 6 p.m. on May 10, 1940, the exact same day, Germany launched its Western offensive. King George VI asked Churchill to form a government. Churchill was 65 years old. He later wrote, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." It sounds dramatic because it was dramatic. Britain was about to face the greatest crisis in its history, and the man now responsible for saving it had been considered a political has-been just a year earlier. Churchill immediately began forming his war cabinet. He kept Chamberlain as Lord President of the Council, partly to maintain Conservative Party unity, partly because Chamberlain still commanded loyalty among Tory MPs. He made Clement Attlee Labour leader, Lord Privy Seal. He brought in Halifax as Foreign Secretary, and critically, he appointed Labour's Ernest Bevin as Minister of Labour, giving the trade unions a direct voice in government. This wasn't just political theater. Churchill understood that if Britain was going to survive, it needed total national unity. Class divisions, party politics, social hierarchies, none of that could matter anymore. But even as Churchill was assembling his government on May 10th and 11th, the news from France was getting worse by the hour. The Dutch Queen had fled to London. The Belgian army was retreating on all fronts. French commanders were sending increasingly desperate messages about breakthrough after breakthrough, and in the back of everyone's mind was the same question: what happens when France falls? Because it was becoming clear that France would fall. The only question was how quickly, and what Britain would do when it stood alone. While panzers rolled through France, a different battle was being fought in the British War Cabinet. A battle over whether to fight at all. Between May 26th and May 28th, 1940, the 5-member War Cabinet held 9 meetings that would determine not just Britain's fate, but the entire course of World War II. These weren't abstract policy discussions. These were brutal, exhausting arguments about national survival, and they came terrifyingly close to going the other way. Lord Halifax had a plan. On May 25th, Italy hadn't yet entered the war. Mussolini was waiting to see which side would win before committing. Halifax proposed that Britain approach Mussolini to mediate peace talks with Hitler, not surrender. Exactly. Halifax was too sophisticated for that word, but a negotiated settlement. Perhaps Germany would accept something less than total victory if Britain acknowledged Germany's continental dominance. Perhaps Hitler would let Britain keep its empire in exchange for a free hand in Europe. Halifax argued this wasn't defeatism. It was realism. France was finished. The British army was trapped at Dunkirk. What was the point of fighting on when the situation was hopeless? Churchill exploded at the idea. He understood something Halifax didn't. There was no negotiating with Hitler. Any peace talks would begin with Britain in the weakest possible position, with its army destroyed and France fallen. Hitler would demand disarmament. He'd demand British neutrality while he consolidated control of Europe. He'd demand the Royal Navy be reduced or handed over, and once Britain agreed to negotiate from weakness, every concession would lead to another, until independence meant nothing. Churchill told the War Cabinet on May 26th, "Nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished." The arguments went on for hours. Halifax kept pushing, insisting that exploring peace terms wasn't the same as surrender. Chamberlain, still recovering from cancer and exhausted, wavered between the two positions. Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, the Labour representatives, backed Churchill but remained quiet. They were junior members in a Tory-dominated cabinet. The meetings were so intense that at one point Churchill left the room. Halifax later wrote in his diary that he'd considered resigning, which would have brought down the government and likely forced new negotiations. On May 28th, Churchill did something unprecedented. He called a meeting of the full cabinet, all 25 ministers, not just the inner war cabinet. He gave them an impassioned speech about fighting on, about never surrendering, about how Britain might go down, but would go down fighting. According to records, the ministers cheered and banged the table. Churchill later wrote, "There occurred a demonstration which, considering the character of the gathering, 25 experienced politicians and parliament men, surprised me. Quite a few seemed to jump up from the table and came running to my chair, shouting and patting me on the back." This was the turning point. Halifax couldn't push for negotiations when the full cabinet was united behind Churchill. The debate was over. Britain would fight on, but here's what makes these meetings so significant. They were secret. The British public had no idea how close their government came to seeking terms with Hitler. Parliament didn't know. The Germans certainly didn't know. If Halifax had won those arguments, if Chamberlain had sided with him, if Churchill had been outvoted, the entire war would have ended differently. Germany would have controlled Europe. There would have been no staging ground for D-Day, no Allied bombing campaign, no Second Front. The Soviet Union would have faced Nazi Germany alone. And Churchill won this battle not with tanks or planes, but with words and will. He understood that once you start asking what terms the enemy might accept, you've already lost. Sometimes survival requires refusing to consider the logical arguments for surrender. 3 days after becoming Prime Minister, on May 13, 1940, Churchill stood before the House of Commons to deliver his first speech as Britain's leader. He hadn't slept more than a few hours since taking office. Reports from France were catastrophic. German forces were crossing the Meuse. The French were in chaos. Everything was falling apart. And now he had to tell Parliament and the nation what kind of leadership they could expect. The speech lasted barely 6 minutes. Churchill hadn't had time to write something elaborate. He'd scribbled notes during brief moments between crisis meetings. But those 6 minutes contained some of the most consequential words ever spoken in the English language. He began simply, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. No false promises, no reassuring platitudes. Just the brutal truth about what lay ahead." Think about how radical this was. Politicians don't usually campaign on suffering. They promise prosperity, security, better days ahead. Churchill was promising the opposite: hardship, sacrifice, and quite possibly death. He continued, "We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering." He was asking the British people to sign up for years of war when most military experts believed the war would be over in weeks with a German victory. Then came the purpose, the mission statement that would define Britain's war. You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. Notice the language. Not fighting for territory, economic interests, or imperial prestige. Fighting against tyranny. This was a moral war, a civilizational struggle. And then the closing line. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory. However long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. That word, survival, that's what made it real. Churchill wasn't promising triumph. He was promising the chance to survive. And he was honest enough to admit that survival itself was uncertain. The reaction in Parliament was mixed. Some MPs were electrified. Others thought Churchill was being needlessly pessimistic, even defeatist. The Times called it a grim speech fitting the grimness of the hour. But here's what mattered. Churchill had drawn a line. There would be no negotiations. No compromised peace. Britain would either win or be destroyed trying. That clarity, that absolute refusal to consider alternatives, gave people something to hold on to when everything else was collapsing. The speech reached beyond Parliament. The BBC broadcast it. Newspapers printed it in full. People read it in London tube stations that would soon become bomb shelters. Factory workers read it during lunch breaks. Soldiers read it while preparing to evacuate from Dunkirk. And in Berlin, German intelligence officers read it and began to realize they might have miscalculated. This wasn't the speech of a government preparing to surrender. This was the speech of a man preparing to burn down his own country rather than let Hitler have it. Churchill understood something about leadership that Halifax never grasped. People can endure almost anything if they believe it matters. They can accept suffering if they believe they're fighting for something larger than themselves. He wasn't offering hope, exactly. He was offering purpose. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, purpose is more valuable than hope. In Berlin, Hitler's intelligence services were watching Britain with absolute confidence. The collapse was imminent. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had spent years analyzing British society and politics. Their reports painted a picture of a nation riddled with class conflict, war-weary from World War I, led by weak politicians, and completely unprepared for modern warfare. Every analysis pointed to the same conclusion: Britain would fold within weeks of France's defeat. They weren't just wrong. They were catastrophically, historically wrong about almost everything. The German intelligence assessment was based on what seemed like solid evidence. Britain had spent the 1930s desperately trying to avoid war. Chamberlain had flown to Munich and handed Hitler Czechoslovakia. The British public had cheered him for it. Peace rallies had drawn massive crowds. The Oxford Union, where Britain's future leaders studied, had passed a resolution in 1933 refusing to fight for king and country. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, Britain did nothing. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Britain did nothing. The pattern seemed clear. The British had no stomach for war. Nazi leadership also fundamentally misunderstood British class structure. They believed the aristocracy and business class would push for peace to protect their wealth and privileges. Lord Halifax seemed to confirm this analysis, an aristocrat advocating for negotiations. German intelligence noted that the British upper classes had social and economic ties to Germany. Many had visited in the 1930s. Some had expressed admiration for Hitler's economic achievements. Surely these people wouldn't want to see their country destroyed in an unwinnable war. Hitler himself contributed to this misunderstanding. He'd studied the British Empire and convinced himself that Britain's ruling class thought like he did, pragmatically focused on power and self-interest. In his mind, once he'd conquered France, the British would recognize that fighting on was pointless. They'd calculate that Germany controlled the continent, that invasion was possible, that the empire could be preserved through negotiation. Hitler expected British rationality to lead to British surrender. He didn't understand that by May 1940, rationality had become a luxury Britain couldn't afford. The Abwehr also completely misjudged Churchill himself. Their files described him as a washed-up politician, a drunk, an impulsive romantic with a record of military disasters. They noted his age, 65, and assumed he lacked the energy for total war. They documented his years in political wilderness during the 1930s and concluded he lacked broad political support. German analysts read his speeches from the 1930s warning about Hitler and dismissed him as a hysteric who'd cried wolf so often that nobody listened anymore. They saw all the evidence of Churchill's weaknesses and missed the evidence of his strengths. Here's what German intelligence failed to grasp: war changes people and nations. The Britain of May 1940 wasn't the Britain of Munich 1938. Chamberlain's appeasement had bought time for rearmament, yes, but it had also done something more important. It had proven to the British people that Hitler couldn't be trusted. Every broken promise, every new aggression, every lie had educated the British public about what they were facing. By 1940, even people who desperately wanted peace understood that peace with Hitler was impossible. The Nazis also misread what the fall of France would do to British psychology. They assumed it would demoralize Britain. Instead, it clarified everything. As long as France was fighting, Britain could share the burden. Once France fell, there was no middle ground anymore. Either Britain fought alone, or Britain ceased to exist as an independent nation. That clarity, that absolute binary choice, united the country in ways that peace never could have. The same class divisions that German intelligence counted on became irrelevant when the alternative was Nazi occupation. By May 26, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped. Over 400,000 Allied troops, British, French, and Belgian, were pinned against the coast at Dunkirk, with their backs to the English Channel. German panzer divisions had them surrounded on three sides. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Every military professional who looked at the situation reached the same conclusion. The entire force was about to be annihilated or captured. It would be the worst military disaster in British history. General Alan Brooke, commanding the Ski Corps, wrote in his diary, "Nothing but a miracle can save the BEF." Now, the miracle had a code name, Operation Dynamo. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding from Dover Castle, was given an impossible task: evacuate as many troops as possible before the Germans closed the trap. The initial estimate was grimly modest. Maybe 45,000 men could be saved over 2 days before the position collapsed. The Royal Navy had about 40 destroyers available, plus various transport vessels. The math was brutal. Even working perfectly, the ships couldn't carry enough men fast enough. Then something unexpected happened. The German advance stopped. On May 24th, Hitler ordered his panzer divisions to halt their advance on Dunkirk. Historians still debate why. Goering had promised the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped army from the air. Some generals wanted to preserve tanks for the push into southern France. Hitler may have believed that Britain would be more willing to negotiate if its army wasn't completely humiliated. Whatever the reason, the halt order gave the British 48 crucial hours to establish a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk. But even with the perimeter holding, the evacuation seemed impossible. Dunkirk's harbor had been heavily bombed. Large ships couldn't get close to the beaches. Troops were waiting in the dunes while German artillery pounded them. Ramsay made a desperate decision. He put out a call for small boats. Any vessel that could cross the channel was requested to sail to Dunkirk. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, private sailboats, river ferries. One boat that made the crossing was the Tamzine, a 14-foot fishing boat that somehow evacuated 7 soldiers. The Sundowner, a private yacht, made multiple trips and brought back 130 men. Over 9 days, from May 26th to June 4th, an armada of 933 vessels crossed the channel. About 700 were small boats. They ferried troops from the beaches to the larger ships waiting in deeper water. German bombers attacked constantly. The RAF flew over 3,500 sorties, providing air cover. Those soldiers on the beaches thought they'd been abandoned because most dogfights happened inland. 6 British destroyers were sunk. 19 were damaged. At least 200 of the small boats were destroyed or damaged. The sea was so thick with oil from torpedoed vessels that soldiers covered in it could barely climb aboard rescue ships. The final count shocked everyone: 338,000. 226 Allied troops were evacuated. 198,290 British, 139,197 French and Belgian. Instead of 45,000 men over 2 days, they'd saved over 300,000 in 9 days. The Germans had captured or killed about 68,000 Allied soldiers and taken 40,000 prisoners, but they'd expected to capture the entire. Forstdoc General Georg von Küchler, commanding the German 18th Army, wrote that he was astonished so many had escaped. German military planners had been counting on those 400,000 prisoners as proof that Britain was defeated. But here's the thing. Dunkirk was still a military disaster. The British lost 68,000 troops, killed, wounded, or captured. They left behind 2,472 artillery pieces, 20,000 motorcycles, 65,000 vehicles, and 76,000 tons of ammunition. The entire British Expeditionary Force's heavy equipment was gone. 11 fighter squadrons had been lost. Britain's army had been driven from the continent. Churchill himself told Parliament on June 4th, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." Yet Germany had expected total annihilation, and Britain had achieved miraculous survival. The propaganda value was immense. The story of the little boats became legend. The defensive perimeter had held against vastly superior forces. And most importantly, Britain still had an army. It would take years to re-equip and expand it, but the men had been saved. They would fight again. On June 4th, 1940, the same day the last troops were evacuated from Dunkirk, Churchill stood in Parliament to deliver what would become the most famous speech of his career. He'd already given Parliament his blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech 3 weeks earlier, but that was before France had collapsed. Before Dunkirk, before Britain stood completely alone, now he needed to do something far more difficult than promise sacrifice. He needed to transform a catastrophic military defeat into a reason to keep fighting. Churchill spent the first part of the speech explaining exactly what had happened in France. No sugarcoating. No propaganda. He walked Parliament through the German breakthrough, the encirclement, the desperate fighting retreat to the coast. He praised the RAF pilots who'd flown themselves to exhaustion, providing air cover. He acknowledged the French troops who'd held the perimeter, so British soldiers could evacuate first. He gave them the military reality because you can't inspire people by lying to them. They needed to understand how bad things were before they could understand why continuing mattered. Then he addressed what everyone was thinking. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. He refused to let people pretend Dunkirk was anything but a defeat. But then, and this is where his genius showed, he reframed what the defeat meant. Yes, Britain had lost the battle, but Britain hadn't lost the war. The soldiers had been saved. The fight would continue, and continuing the fight was itself a kind of victory over the expectation of surrender. He laid out Britain's strategic situation with brutal honesty. The German army would now turn south to finish off France. When France fell, notice he said when, not if, Britain would face invasion. He told Parliament, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air." Each phrase built on the last, expanding the scope of where and how Britain would resist. Then came the crescendo, the lines that would be quoted for the next 80 years. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Notice the escalation from beaches to landing grounds to fields to streets to hills. Churchill was describing a fighting retreat into the interior of Britain itself. He was promising that even if Germany landed, even if they took the coasts, even if they reached London, the fight would continue until the last British soldier fell. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added the final line. "And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old." This wasn't just about Britain anymore. This was about keeping any part of the free world alive, until America could be convinced to enter the war. The speech worked on multiple levels. For the British public, it was a rallying cry that transformed humiliation into defiance. For Parliament, it was a clear statement that the government would never negotiate. For the Germans, who received full translations within hours, it was a shock. Where was the peace offer they'd been expecting? Where was the recognition that continuing was futile? Instead, Churchill was promising to fight street by street, house by house, until Britain was destroyed or Germany was defeated. In Berlin, the speech caused genuine confusion. German intelligence had predicted that Dunkirk would break British morale. They'd expected Churchill to fall and Halifax to seek terms. Instead, Churchill's position had strengthened. The evacuation had somehow made the British more determined, not less. Hitler had won the greatest military victory since Napoleon, and his enemy was refusing to acknowledge defeat. The entire psychological calculation had been wrong. France officially surrendered on June 22, 1940. Hitler staged the ceremony in the same railway car where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I. The symbolism was deliberate. Humiliation repaid with humiliation. Germany now controlled virtually all of Western Europe. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France had all fallen in less than a year. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. Italy had joined the war on Germany's side. Britain stood alone with no allies and no realistic path to victory. Hitler expected a peace offer within days. He'd conquered the continent. Britain's army had been driven from Europe. The Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF. The Wehrmacht had proven itself unstoppable. Surely now, with France gone and the situation obviously hopeless, Churchill would be replaced by reasonable men who understood that fighting on meant national suicide. Hitler even prepared a peace proposal. Britain could keep its empire and navy in exchange for recognizing German dominance in Europe. He thought it was generous. The offer never came. Instead, on July 14, 1940, Bastille Day, another deliberate symbol, Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to attack the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria to prevent it from falling into German hands. Over 1,200 French sailors died. It was a horrific decision, attacking yesterday's ally to prevent tomorrow's threat, but it sent an unmistakable message to both Hitler and Roosevelt. Britain would do whatever was necessary to continue fighting. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no surrender. Hitler finally accepted what his intelligence services had gotten wrong. Britain wasn't going to quit. On July 16th, he issued Führer Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. But the invasion had a prerequisite. Germany needed air superiority. The Royal Navy was too powerful to challenge directly. But if the Luftwaffe could destroy the RAF, then German barges could cross the channel under air cover. Everything depended on winning the air battle. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 and reached its peak in August and September. The Luftwaffe threw everything at the RAF, attacking airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories. The fighting was desperate. Young RAF pilots were flying 4 or 5 missions per day. Some squadrons lost half their pilots in a week. Aircraft production couldn't keep up with losses. By early September, the RAF was on the verge of collapse. Fighter Command had lost 466 pilots, killed or too wounded to fly. Training schools couldn't replace them fast enough. A few more weeks and the RAF would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. Then Hitler made a critical mistake. On September 7th, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London. The change was partly retaliation for an RAF raid on Berlin, partly an attempt to break British morale by terrorizing civilians. But it gave Fighter Command the breathing room it desperately needed. Airfields could be repaired. New pilots could be trained. Aircraft production could catch up. The Blitz was horrific for London. Over 40,000 civilians would die in the bombing campaign, but it saved the RAF. By the end of September, it was clear that Germany wasn't going to achieve air superiority. RAF fighters kept appearing. No matter how many the Luftwaffe shot down, British radar systems gave them advanced warning. And critically, German pilots who bailed out over England became prisoners, while British pilots who survived could fly again the next day. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. He never officially canceled it, but everyone understood. Britain wasn't going to be invaded. Churchill's speeches had proven more effective than anyone, including Churchill himself, had dared. Hope Germany had won every military battle and lost the only war that mattered. The war of will. Britain hadn't defeated Germany, but Britain had survived long enough that defeating it was no longer possible. Hitler would turn east and invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war. The alliance that would eventually defeat Germany was forming, but it only formed because Britain had refused to surrender when every rational calculation said surrender was inevitable. Those 3 weeks in May 1940, when Halifax pushed for negotiations, when Churchill fought back, when the War Cabinet decided Britain would fight on, those weeks determined everything that followed. If Britain had sought terms, there would have been no Battle of Britain, no Blitz survival story, no inspiration for occupied Europe, no partnership with America, no D-Day. Churchill understood something that all the intelligence analysts and military experts missed. Sometimes, refusing to lose is more important than having a plan to win. You survive first. You figure out victory later, and sometimes, just sometimes, survival is enough.